Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well today by the grace of God. I'm very blessed to be giving the message today. So, the title of this message is Justified Freely, and it is based on Romans chapter 3 that we just heard. But before we get into it, I just want to take a time to say that the praise and worship that we heard was so touching and it touched my spirit in a way. And I just want to thank God for allowing these musicians to be used by God. So I just wanted to say that. So some background information on Romans chapter 3. So previously, last week in Romans chapter 2, Paul explains that the possession of the law or circumcision will not save a Jewish person. So when we get to Romans chapter 3, verses 1 to 2 say, "What advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of uncircumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God." So here, Paul says, what is the advantage of being God's chosen nation? This is because their Jewish nationality cannot provide them salvation. Now, when he says, much in every way, Paul knows that there are many advantages and benefits that God gave to the Jewish people. A notable one is that he entrusted them with the oracles of God, which speak of God's written revelation before the time of Jesus. He gave the people his word, the word of God, and this is an indescribable gift. When we reach verses 3 to 4, it says, "For what if some did not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? Certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged." So when it asks, what if some did not believe? This is saying that though some Jewish people had rejected the gospel, it did not mean that God's work was futile or it was without effect. Because even today, there are some who have rejected the truth of God, rejected the revelation of God, but it does not mean that he has played a tremendous impact in our lives today. Now, when we get to verse 4, it says again, "Certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man a liar." Paul reminds us that God will be justified in all his actions. In the end, it will be shown that even our unrighteousness somehow proclaimed his righteousness and glory, even if only in judgment. So verse 5 says, "But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man." So we see here in verse 5 that Paul brings the counter argument of an opponent that is asking these questions. When it says, "Is God unjust who inflicts wrath?" Paul was familiar with the line of thinking that says, God is in control of everything. Even if I do evil or my evil will, it will ultimately demonstrate his righteousness. Therefore, God is unjust if he inflicts his wrath on me because I'm a pawn in his hand. Many people make that case. Judas could have made that case by saying, "Lord, I know that I betrayed Jesus, but you used it for good." But then again, God could have stated that yes, he used it for good, but Judas's wickedness was still Judas's wickedness because there was no pure motive in his heart at all. Therefore, it is no credit to him that God brought good out of his evil, so he is guilty before God. This scenario here can also be applied in our lives. We may think sometimes, oh yeah, I did this one thing, or I made this one choice that was really bad, but God turned it for good. But if you take a look at it this way, if your heart wasn't pure, it's just as similar to Judas's case and is similar to his guiltiness. So now, when we get to verses 6 to 8, it says, "Certainly not. For then how will God judge the world?" For if the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I also still judged as a sinner? And why not say, let us do evil that good may come, as we are slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, their condemnation is just. In verse 6, Paul dismisses the question of his opponent easily. If things were such as his opponent suggested, then God could judge no one. It's true that God will use even the unrighteousness of a man to accomplish his work, his will, and bring praise to his name. We see that perfect example in Judas's betrayal of Jesus. Nevertheless, part of the way God glorifies himself in man's sin is by righteously judging that unrighteousness. So, how will God judge the world? For both Paul and his readers, it was a given that a judgment day was coming, when some will be acquitted and some will be condemned. He didn't need to contest this point. It was simply understood in the Jewish culture. Paul understood that God would judge the world, both Jew and Gentile. Many of the Jews of Paul's day figured that God would condemn the Gentile for his sin, but save the Jew despite his sin. Okay, so now in verse 7, Paul restates the objection of an imaginary questioner. It says, if God will glorify himself through my lie, how can he judge me, since I seem to indirectly increase his glory? Verses 8 statement, let us do evil that good may come, is a perversion of Paul's doctrine of justification by faith, and an extension of the objection of his imaginary questioner. If you take the thinking of Paul's adversary far enough, you end up thinking and telling yourself, let's sin as much as we can so God can be glorified even more. But this is just incorrect thinking. This shows us that one way to examine a teaching is to extend its meaning and consequences and see where you end up. Of course, let us do evil that good may come was not Paul's teaching. He was slanderously reported to teach this. Still, it is possible to see how this accusation came as Paul freely preached forgiveness and salvation by grace through faith in Jesus, not works. Verse, their condemnation is just. Paul will even answer such an absurd twisting of his gospel. He simply says of those who would teach such things or accuse Paul of teaching them, their condemnation is just. God rightly condemns anyone who teaches or believes such a thing. Twisting the glorious free gift of God in Jesus into a supposed license to sin is perhaps the peak of man's wickedness. It takes the most beautiful gift of God and perverts it, or it mocks it. This twisting is so sinful, Paul saves it for last, because it is beyond hypocrisy of the moralist and beyond the false confidence of the Jew. Verse 9 reads, what then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin. Since Paul was Jewish by birth and by heritage, when he says we, he means we Jews because he's Jewish. That point is, by nature, the Jewish person is no more right with God than the pagan or the moralist. Paul demonstrates that the pagan, the moralist, and the Jew are all under sin and under condemnation. Under sin. This is a very powerful phrase. It speaks of our slavery to sin, literally meaning sold under sin. By nature, everyone knows what it's like to be a slave to sin, both the Jews and the Greeks. Now, verses 10 to 18 read, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seek after God. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So, this is a very long excerpt here, so let's break it down. There is none righteous, no, not one. Here, Paul looks at the human condition from top to bottom. He begins with the head and moves down to the feet. This look at the human condition is depressing. What's the point? The Apostle Paul wants us to understand our complete inability to save ourselves. The fall touches every part of man's being, and the inventory of body parts corrupted by the fall demonstrates this. There is none righteous, no, not one. When God finds none righteous, it is because truly there are none righteous. It is as if there were some and God couldn't see them. No one is righteous on their own will, and we see that in this chapter. There has never been a truly righteous man apart from Jesus Christ. Verse 11 says, there is none who seeks after God. We deceive ourselves into thinking that man on his own really does seek after God. But don't all religions and rituals and practices from the beginning of time demonstrate that man seeks after God? Not at all. If man initiates the search, then he doesn't seek the true God, but rather he seeks an idol that he makes himself. Verse 12, they have together become unprofitable. The word unprofitable has the idea of rotten fruit. It speaks of something that was permanently bad and therefore useless. Verse 13, their throat is an open tomb. With these references from the Psalms, Paul calls virtually every part of man's body into guilt. The throat, the tongue, the lips, the mouth, the feet, and the eyes are filled with sin and rebellion against God. Now, if we skim down to verse 18, it says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. This verse right here summarizes the entire thought of the message. Every sin and rebellion against God happens because we do not have a proper respect for him. Wherever there is sin, there is no fear of God. Verses 19 to 20 convey that the law cannot save us from our sin and the penalty that it deserves. It reads, now we know that whatever the law says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. So, here, Paul points out that this horrific description of man's utter sinfulness comes to us in the law, and it is intended for those under the law to silence every critic and demonstrate the universal guilt of mankind, that all the world may become guilty before God. When we go back to verse 19, it reads, it says, to those who are under the law. If God speaks this way to those who had the law and attempted to do the law, it is evident that by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. Remember that many Jewish people of Paul's day took every passage in the Old Testament describing evil and applied it only solely to the Gentiles, not to themselves. Paul makes it clear that God speaks to those who are under the law. Verse 20 reads, therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. The law cannot save us. The law can't justify anyone. It is useful in giving us the knowledge of sin, but it cannot save us. Only Jesus Christ can. Since the time of Adam and Eve, People have tried to justify themselves by the deeds of the law. In the Garden of Eden, Adam tried to make himself presentable to God by making coverings out of fig leaves. In Job, the oldest book in the Bible, the problem is presented clearly. How can a man be righteous before God? God makes part of the answer clear here through Paul. The answer is not in performance of good works in the deeds of the law. How we need to deeply understand this, that by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified. This means that the law, having been broken, now can only condemn us. It can never save us. This means that if we could now begin to perfectly keep the law of God, it cannot make up for the past disobedience or remove present guilt. This also means that keeping the law is not God's way of salvation or a blessing under the new covenant. Now, we get to the part that shows the revelation of the righteousness of God. Verse 21 reads, "But now the righteousness of God, apart from the law, is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets." This phrase, "but now," provides the most glorious transition from the judgment of Romans 3 verse 20 to the justification of Romans 3 verse 21. The phrase, "but now," speaks of the newness of God's work in Christ Jesus. It really is a new covenant. Being witnessed by the law and the prophets reminds us that there is still continuity with God's work in the former times. The next phrase, "apart from the law," means that the law cannot save us, but God reveals a righteousness that will save us, a righteousness that is apart from the law. This is the essence of God's plan of salvation in Jesus Christ. It is the salvation that is offered apart from the law, apart from our own earning, our own deserving, and apart from our own merits. Being witnessed by the law and the prophets. This righteousness is not a novelty. Paul didn't invent it. It was predicted a long time ago, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. The Old Testament said that righteousness was coming. Verse 22 shows how the righteousness is communicated to man. It reads, "Even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe, for there is no difference." In verse 21, Paul told us how this righteousness does not come through the deeds of the law. It is apart from the law. Now, Paul tells us how this saving righteousness does come. It is through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe. The righteousness of God is not ours by faith. It is ours through faith. We do not earn righteousness by our own faith. We receive righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ. Verses 23 to 24 explain man's universal need and God's universal offer. It reads, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus." So, Paul develops his teaching about salvation around three themes: justification, redemption, and propitiation. So, justification solves the problem of man's guilt before a righteous judge. Redemption solves the problem of a man's slavery to sin, the world, and the devil. Propitiation, meaning the calming of righteous, solves the problem of offending our Creator. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God is a universal offer to be justified freely by his grace. It is open to everyone who will believe. It's impossible to describe every way that we fall short, but here are 4 important ways we fall short of the glory of God. Number 1, we fail to give God glory that is due to him in our words, our thoughts, and our actions. Number 2, we fail to qualify for and thereby reject glory and reward that God gives his faithful servants. Number 3, we fail to properly reflect God's glory by refusing to be conformed into his image. And number 4, we fail to obtain the final glory God will bestow on his people at the end of all history. Now, if we go back to verse 24, it says, justified freely by his grace. Being in such a sinful state, the only way we can be justified is to be justified freely. We can't purchase it with our good works at all. If it isn't made free to us, we can't have it all. So, we are justified freely by his grace, his unmerited favor, given to us without regard to what we deserve. It is a giving motivated purely by the giver and motivated by nothing in the one who receives it. Verses 25 and 26 show how the death of Jesus satisfies the righteous judgment of God. It reads, whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood, through faith, to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So, Jesus, by his death, by his blood, was a substitute sacrifice, which is the word propitiation. He was a propitiation for us. As he was judged in our place, the Father could demonstrate his righteousness in judgment against sin, while sparing those who deserved the actual judgment. Whom God set forth as a propitiation. This shows us that Jesus did not somehow appease a reluctant, unwilling Father to hold back his wrath. Instead, it was God the Father who initiated the propitiation, whom God set forth. Passed over the sins. God, in his forbearance, had passed over the sins of the Old Testament saints who trusted in the coming Messiah. At the cross, these sins were no longer passed over, but rather they were paid for. The idea is that through the animal sacrifice of the Old Testament, those who looked in faith to the coming Messiah had their sins covered by like a promissory note, which was like blood of animals. That temporary covering was redeemed for full payment at the cross. The work of Jesus on the cross freed God from the charge that he lightly passed over sin committed before the cross. Those sins were passed over for a time, but then they were finally paid for. That he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. At the cross, God demonstrated his righteousness by offering man justification. He gave them a legal verdict of not guilty while remaining completely just, because the righteous penalty of sin had been paid at the cross. It's easy to see how someone could be only just. Simply send every guilty sinner to hell as a just judge would do. It's easy to see how someone could only be the justifier. Simply tell every guilty sinner, I declare a pardon. You're all declared not guilty. But only God could find a way to be both the just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Verse 27 reads, where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? No, but by the law of faith. Boasting in the salvation which comes through the gospel of Jesus Christ is excluded. Where is boasting then? It shouldn't be anywhere, because we are justified freely by his grace. There is no room for self-congratulation or credit. By what law? Boasting and pride are not excluded because there is some specific passage in the law against them. Instead, pride is excluded because it is completely incompatible with the salvation that is freely ours through faith. Boasting is excluded by the law of faith. So, by the law of faith, meaning no room for boasting, This is why the natural man hates being justified freely by his grace. Grace absolutely refuses to recognize his merits and gives no place to his pride whatsoever. So, verses 28 to 30 show that justification is found for both the Jew and the Gentile, apart from the deeds of the law. It reads, "Therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law. Or is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also, since there is one God who would justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith." So, justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law. It isn't that we are justified by faith plus whatever deeds we do. We are justified by faith alone, apart from the deeds of the law. So, apart from the deeds of the law, doesn't James contradict this in passages like James 2, verses 14 to 26? How can we say that faith alone that saves apart from the deeds of the law? It is true faith alone saves, but true faith, saving faith, has a distinct character. It is not just agreeing with certain facts, but it is directing the mind and will in agreement with God. The whole purpose of the book of James is to describe the character of this saving faith. The phrase, "yes, of the Gentiles also," this righteousness is offered to both the Jew and the Gentile. The universal character of the offer is demonstrated by a simple fact. Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? Of course he is. If there is only one God, then God is the God of the Gentiles as much as he is God of the Jews. It's just up to the Gentiles, to recognize him as God. There is one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Not only is this righteousness available to both Jew and Gentile, it is also received the same way by both Jew and Gentile. Since one God justifies both Jew and Gentile, he justifies them in the same way, by faith and through faith. Verse 31. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. We can see how someone might ask, if the law doesn't make us righteous, what good is it? Paul, you have just made the law void. You're going against the law of God. Of course, Paul doesn't make the law void. As Apostle will demonstrate in Romans 4, the law anticipated the coming gospel of justification by faith apart from the deeds of the law. Therefore, the gospel establishes the law, fulfilling its own prediction. So now, reflection. That
Good morning, everyone. And I just want to thank for letting me be here and smug. Just want to say good job, Josh. Did. And I just want to bless everyone. But the reflection for me is Romans 12:12, which I'll be reading right now, which is be joyful in hope, patience and affection, faithful and pray. This short verse is very powerful and explains three different things. To be joyful, joyful in hope, which you have to be, God will protect you and he will make every single promise that you have come true. And second thing that actually he mentions is patience and affection. Stay strong and do not give up when everything seems wow. And when it comes to the hardships, you have to stay strong, faithful and pray. Keep talking to God. Never stop talking. Because if you stop separate, if you separate, you won't get closer to him, and then you start having more hardships. That's when we need to get closer to him so he could take his battles for you. That's mostly what I have in my reflection. But Romans 12:12 is a really strong verse for everyone. And I believe that it's very good.